Hotel lobbies alike. Yep, when winter comes to Boston, things heat up in a hurry. Book your trip at meetboston.com.
Hey guys, ready or not, 2024 is here, and we here at Breaking Points are already thinking of ways we can up our game for this critical election.
We rely on our premium subs to expand coverage, upgrade the studio, add staff, give you guys the best independent coverage that is possible. If you like what we're all about, it means the absolute world to have your support. What are you waiting for? Become a premium subscriber today at breakingpoints.com. Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Crystal?
Indeed, we do. Lots to get to this morning. We got all your CPAC highlights for you. President Trump winning the straw poll there quite handily and making some noteworthy comments. We also had Steve Bannon sort of declaring war on Fox News and new revelations about exactly what went down there during the election and Stop the Steal and all of that, which is pretty interesting. Also, another train derailment in Ohio. This comes as Pete Buttigieg is kind of acknowledging that he screwed all of this up. This is an amazing headline in CNN. He's rethinking how he does his job. Oh, really? Okay. Good. We'll tell you about that. Yeah. DNC rigging over the top. They are kind of rejecting democracy in terms of the Democratic primary as Marianne Williamson declares for president. Some interesting comments there. Interesting coverage on MSNBC. We'll break all of that down for you. And Russell Brand getting a lot of attention with some comments about cable news himself on Bill Maher's show over on HBO. We are also excited to have Ryan Graves on the show. That's that's going to be a good one.
It's going to be fun. I think the UFO people in particular will enjoy it. But anybody. He was a pilot, and he saw a lot of interesting things while he was up in the
I'm excited to talk to him.
Yes. Let's start with 2024. President Trump returning to CPAC in a marathon, hour and 40-minute long speech. We cut together some highlights for you. The main takeaway, I am your retribution. Let's take a listen.
We had a Republican Party that was ruled by freaks, neocons, globalists, open border zealots, and fools. But we are never going back to the party of Paul Ryan, Karl Rove, and Jeb Bush. We're not going back to people that want to destroy our great social security system. Even some in our own party, I wonder who that might be, that want to raise the minimum age of Social Security to 70, 75, or even 80 in some cases, and that are out to cut Medicare to a level that it will no longer be recognizable. If you look at Ukraine, and we all feel so badly about it, but why isn't NATO putting up dollar for dollar with us? We put up $140 billion, and they put up just a tiny fraction of that. China-loving politicians, of which there are many. You're listening to this, Mitch McConnell? Are you listening? But I stand here today, and I'm the only candidate who can make this promise. I will prevent, and very easily, World War III, very easily. And for those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution. I am your retribution. Not going to let this happen.
I am your retribution. Powerful, I guess, grievance message. I mean, it fits a little bit with American carnage, but the reason the media was focusing in on a lot of that one, obviously that one's on Stop the Steal, but the previous ones, Crystal, a lot of that is vintage Trump. That is, I'm going to end, end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. I can't tell you how I'm going to do it. No World War III on my watch, something that Biden has not yet been able to say publicly. And then really, I think the most important one was the Medicare and Social Security, the flaying of Paul Ryan, calling out Mitch McConnell, the establishment GOP, and just saying, look what these people want to do. They want to cut benefits for hard-working, earning seniors. I am not going to let them do that. So you put it all together, you get a very traditional America First speech that he gave there, sprinkled in with like some little Stop the Steal there at the end, a very vague reference to all of that. Not an accident, I think, though, in order to unite the hardcore Trumpers who feel like the election was stolen with a broader economically populist message, which obviously won in the White House in 2016. Overall, I mean, you put that together like I think that we did, and that's a solid message. It's a solid message in this primary.
And the other thing that I was thinking about, I mean, the I am your retribution, that has always been the animating energy behind the Trump group.
That's why it was smart.
Yeah.
Smart.
Exactly. So even, in 2016, the policy pieces loomed a lot larger than at this point they do, even as I do think he is taking out some important positions. But what people really love about this guy is that all the people that hate you or that you hate, they are livid about Donald Trump. And so leaning into that, I mean, that reminds people why they fell in love with this guy in the Republican base the first time around. So, I mean, this guy is back. He's much more effective than he was during 2020, much more effective than he was in the office season. He's sort of back to form.
He is fully back into form. He's also gave an interview with Newsmax. Newsmax's James Rosen right before, where he promised that even if he does get indicted, I am still running, for everybody who's maintaining the fantasy that he won't. Take a listen to that.
Can you take this moment to assure your donors and your supporters that you're in this race to stay no matter what happens with those investigations if you are indicted one or more times?
Sure. Well, they did two phony impeachments, and we won that, and the Republicans stuck together, and we won, as you know, we went up very substantially in the polls. These are witch hunts. These have been going on for a long time. They've weaponized justice in our country. It's a disgrace, and I think people are very angry about it. Even Democrats are very angry about it.
So you'll stay in the race?
Oh, absolutely. I wouldn't even think about leaving.
So there you go. He says he's going to run even if he does get indicted. For those who are wondering, as we have previously shown, Eugene Debs, the socialist candidate for president in 1920, while imprisoned in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, actually received almost 1 million votes for candidate. So there is a precedent, one that you can be in prison, in a federal prison actually, and still run and receive votes for federal office. I guess that would be a fun one if it ever came down to precedent. But so many indications here about the strength of Trump. Put this next one up there on the screen. Trump overwhelmingly winning the CPAC primary straw poll. Now, does the CPAC primary straw poll matter? I mean, not really. Rand Paul has won it at certain points, other politicians who never ended up having a chance in hell. But when I look at this, what I'm looking at these are not only Republicans, these are the faithful, the people who will fly from all over the country and attend every single one of these. And 62% in the poll, Crystal. DeSantis comes in second at 20%. And then the third place pick at 5% was Perry Johnson, a businessman.
Do you know who this guy is?
Yeah, I know he tried to run
him.
for the governor of Michigan. I knew his name, but I had to go back and look it up. Carrie Lake actually received the most support for vice presidential candidate with 20%. DeSantis, she actually beat DeSantis for the VP slot. Once again, does CPAC matter? Does the primary poll matter? No, it is not indicative of anything other than what the people at CPAC feel. But I can't help but pair it with that clip that we played in our previous show of Brian Kilmeade of Fox News going to the people in the diner in Florida.
Yeah.
And is like, hey, guys, who are you all going to vote for? And all but one says that they're going to vote for Trump. And even that one was like Trump and Nikki Haley for vice president. And she was wearing a DeSantis T-shirt.
Yeah.
And she wouldn't put DeSantis
She
on
was
the top
saying
of her
she was
ticket.
saying Trump or DeSantis.
Right, that's right.
Kilmeade came over and was like,
Yeah.
you've got a DeSantis shirt on.
Right.
You must be for DeSantis. And she was like, Trump or DeSantis.
Yeah.
She felt like cornered into it because she was wearing the T-shirt. But I mean, listen, I think it's pretty clear this is the guy to beat at this point. And, you know, with regards to him saying he's going to run regardless of indictment, I mean, this was always obvious, but I think there was a lot of elite Republican wish casting that maybe he would just like melt away and sort of like implode and self-destruct. That's obviously not happening. And that's why you see all of this cast of characters lining up to try to jockey to be the number 2 choice. Well, number 2 doesn't count for anything if number 1 is still in there and still holding strong. You know, also with regard to that, the thing from the Trump presidency that Americans really viscerally reacted against was January 6th and Stop the Steal. And I think that was really clear in the midterms. Republicans right afterwards, they took a shot at criticizing him over it. You know, Fox News did, some of his allies did, Mitch McConnell did, Nikki Haley did. And then they kind of backed away from that. And since they were not able to get the Republican base on their side with regard to January 6th and Stop the Steal, they really aren't armed with the most effective, potent attack they could possibly have against Trump. I mean, that is the thing that the American people really viscerally rejected about his administration. And so they've taken that off the table. If he gets indicted, they're going to have to defend him or at least say nothing about it and sort of like, you know, be demure about it. And I think it leaves them in a really difficult position because other than that, he's in a better position vis-a-vis the base than they ultimately are with regard to the positions that he's staking out from an issue perspective.
That's why I don't have any sympathy for them. It's like, okay, then don't say you're going to cut Social Security and pump hundreds of millions of dollars into Ukraine. It's actually not difficult to get on the right side of the base. But, you know, okay, they would rather have their elite positions. Well, then you're basically guaranteeing yourself Trump having some fun with Nikki Haley's speech. Just put this up there on the screen, putting it out, saying, congratulations to Nikki Haley on drawing such a large crowd at CPAC. As I told her, Nikki, follow your heart. For those who are just listening, it shows not even half empty is generous. I'm looking at maybe 1/4. Haley also
the speech was bad.
She's got to be one of the dumbest politicians I've ever seen because she gave a speech immediately after CPAC at the Club for Growth. For those who don't know, it's the Tea Party group. They got into a big fight with Trump over the Ohio primary when they backed Josh Mandel over J.D. Vance, and they were actually attacking President Trump. They want to return to a more economically libertarian candidacy, primary, et cetera. Okay, well, she spoke at the conference, at the Club for Growth conference. She's like, I take great pride in being one of the politicians that was invited here. There were some other people that weren't invited here as a veiled attack at Trump. I'm like, yeah, lady, winning the Club for Growth primary invitation, that's definitely how you win a GOP primary because it's not like they haven't lost all the ones where they've backed somebody against Trump. Just complete and total idiocy. I mean, all I guess it will show, Crystal, is, yeah, she's going to have a hell of a lot of money. I mean, I don't remember a time when a hell of a lot of money in a Republican primary with Trump has ever mattered at all.
And maybe because, you know, it's not like she was the only candidate who was invited.
Yes.
It's not like they picked her.
Point.
DeSantis was there as well.
Yeah.
And I think maybe, I don't know, some of the other ones were there too, but Trump didn't get an invite because they have this rift. Like, congratulations, you won over, you know, a group of wealthy elites within the Republican Party. Maybe they're auditioning you. Potentially, you're going to get their support. But yeah, obviously all of these other contenders, they have at least one billionaire who's willing to back them. And so, you know, they've convinced themselves that they really have a shot. I think they have been imagining somehow the Trump problem would just solve itself and they wouldn't have to say anything, wouldn't have to do anything, and he would just go away. And I don't know what fantasy world they were ultimately living in when they came up with that notion.
Yeah, look, it's a total fantasy. As you could see from that speech, Trump is fully back. The party faithful, at the very least, remain with him, and it really remains his race to lose. Okay, let's go to the second part here. This is some other very interesting stuff with Ron DeSantis. DeSantis increasingly has been in a tough position. How do I differentiate myself from Trump? First, he said, quote, it's silly season, which might be the lamest possible comeback that I've ever seen. But I actually thought this was a revealing one. He is asked whether or not a Trump endorsement matters for him. And you can just see him contort and become extremely uncomfortable. He blinks like 61 times in 30 seconds as the person who flags this for us. Everybody just take a listen. For those who are listening, we're going to describe it to you on the other side.
In 2023, how much do you believe a Trump endorsement matters in American Republican politics?
You know, I don't know. I mean, I think our voters always make their own decisions, and they consider, obviously, endorsements. And at that time, when he was president, his was the big enchilada. But our voters want to look at you and size you up, and they take the responsibility very, very seriously.
So, look, he's blinking there. He's like, and clearly did not take well to answering that question.
Just very clearly, lots of body language is very uncomfortable.
I've been paying close attention to DeSantis, and look, he does not open himself up for a lot of interviews. Rupert Murdoch apparently loves Ron DeSantis, and so he's been calling him all the time and convincing him to do interviews. So DeSantis did this print interview with the Times of London. It's like a conservative paper that Murdoch owns, and he gets real testy whenever you press him on the specifics. One of them was on Ukraine, and they were asking him, like, okay, do you agree with the Trump position on Ukraine? And he basically cut him off and was like, okay, let's, go ahead and move on here. Now, to one extent, look, all politicians do that whenever they get uncomfortable, but also is showing a little bit that whenever it gets into the weeds, he's not comfortable just passing these things around. Now, look, he is a governor, so he doesn't necessarily have to have an answer on these, but, you need to show a little bit more of a backbone whenever you're in these interviews if you're going to want to be a presidential candidate and have a real lane outside of where Trump is right now. He's just trying to have it all both ways.
I'm not comparing Ron DeSantis to the political capabilities of Kamala Harris.
Okay.
However, I will say that prior to her running for president, the word in political circles was that she was very cautious. And even with potentially friendly media personalities, she was very careful about what interviews she did. She had to be fully prepared. She's one of these that always the aides will be like, all right, what specifically are you going to ask her about before she got in there? And I think in part because she didn't get that practice of mixing it up with the press, or was incapable, I think, really, of being able to mix it up with more adversarial questioning, it made her a very brittle political figure, where the only thing she could really do was, if she had like a set piece that she'd practiced and talking points that she'd practiced, she could deliver them. But outside of that, if you had an actual give and take where you have to think on your feet, which is a skill that you develop like any other skill, she is very, very, very bad. And we've seen that particularly on display during this presidency, the Lester Holt interview, where she's talking about, the border situation, et cetera. So I think that Ron DeSantis is doing himself a disservice by not taking some calculated risks here of getting the practice of mixing it up with more media figures, including some who may be more adversarial, because it's better to have some flubs and some screw-ups now when the stakes are a little bit less high. You think you're going to be able to mix it up with Donald Trump if you can't, handle a Fox News question here? Exactly. So the fact that he is so careful and cautious and pre-planned and selective about the interviews that he does, I think it's a telling sign, and it also, like I said, I think does him a disservice in terms of the practice that he needs to be able to handle a presidential primary.
Absolutely right. And at the same time, you've got one of the other potential rivals. I'm putting rivals in quotes here because it would have been more of a media creation. But honestly, I want to give the man props. Larry Hogan, the governor of Maryland, saying, I will not be a candidate in the GOP primary. Let's take a listen to what he said.
I think I can continue to contribute toward getting the Republican Party back to a more traditional big tent party that can win elections again, without causing being part of a train wreck that might repeat history and just allow us to nominate Donald Trump as our nominee, because I think that would be bad for the party and bad for the country. Really, I just don't believe that he was the right person to lead the party, and we've proven that, and we've lost the last 3 elections in a row.
So, look, he gives a case there on why he entering would just make it more likely that Trump would win. And you know what? Let's respect the man. I don't agree with Larry Hogan on a lot, but I think that his calculus is correct. One of those where he's not letting his own narcissism get the better of him, and he's like, I think there's probably another candidate. We can probably all unify around him, vis-a-vis Trump, and then that person has a more realistic chance of taking him down. If you don't want Trump to win, that's the best possible case that you could make. Unfortunately, we have seen that narcissism is pretty significant of a personality disorder amongst the Mike Pompeos and the Nikki Haley's and them of the world. I don't get it. I don't see their case. This is so obvious to anyone with a brain. And so I actually think we should take time to praise the politicians who are realistic. Thank you. You know, you won in Maryland. Congratulations. The idea, though, that you would ever win a GOP primary, it's a complete and total fantasy. So let's give them props whenever they step out.
Listen, it's very clear that the best chance they have of defeating Trump is if everybody who's in the Trump skeptical or never Trump faction of the party unites behind one candidate. And if you have, you know, if Larry Hogan jumped in and he got, let's say, 5% of the vote, that's 5% that's not going to Ron DeSantis that he could potentially pick up. And all of that is going to be absolutely critical when you are mounting at this point a real come from behind campaign to try to take out the guy who is the former president and the current clear leader of the Republican Party. He wrote an op-ed about this too. Let's go ahead and put this up on the screen from the New York Times. He said, in part, Larry Hogan, I'm not seeking the Republican nomination for president. I believe the tides are finally turning. Republican voters are growing tired of the drama and are open to new leadership. And while I'm optimistic about the future of the Republican Party, I'm deeply concerned about this next election. We cannot afford to have Mr. Trump as our nominee and suffer defeat for the fourth consecutive election cycle. To once again be a successful governing party, we must move on from Mr. Trump. There are several competent Republican leaders who have the potential to step up and lead, but the stakes are too high for me to risk being part of another multi-car pileup that could potentially help Mr. Trump recapture the nomination. I think all of that is very, well, I would say, I believe the tides are finally turning part is maybe a little bit of wishful thinking, but in terms of the strategic calculus here, it's very clearly thought out, and I think very obvious that, you know, the best chance that they have is to unite behind him.
Yes, I just am in favor of people being realistic here. Like with all these, you know, politicians, everybody tries to look at the Obama campaign of 2008 as come from behind. Obama, first of all, was an already sitting senator. He was coming up against Hillary. He had a hell of a lot of money and also an organic actual base of the party that wanted him to run. He used that to differentiate himself from Hillary and able to win those come-from-behind campaigns. But he was starting off almost from a DeSantis level of support before he ended up winning that primary. You have to have much more name recognition. You can't be one of these one-percenters. In fact, I went back and looked. There is not a single candidate who's won a major party nomination who started off at 1 or 2%. Almost every single one of them had massive name ID. The only example you might be able to point to is a Bill Clinton, but even Bill Clinton had been a governor for 12 years. He was the head of the committee. He'd given major speeches at the Democratic committee whenever that type of stuff mattered. And he was polling at, what, 10, 15%? He got third in New Hampshire, eventually was able to come back and win it in the New York primary. But even he did not start off from even close to the handicap that a lot of these people would be starting off from. So there's no historical basis for a lot of these people's candidacy.
It would be one thing, you know, it is a different time now, social media, whatever, like, it would be one thing if these weren't individuals who had already long been on the national scene. When I'm thinking about Nikki Haley, Mike Pompeo, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
But the American people kind of know who you are. They kind of seen you in action, and they aren't supporting you yet. So what are you going to put into a campaign that is going to dramatically, ultimately shift that? So I think especially for the folks who have been in the political world, on the political scene for a long period of time, and they're still polling at, you know, 5, 7, 10% sometimes in the case of Mike Pence, I think it is unlikely that you are going to shift that dynamic, especially when, listen, they maybe had a chance to kind of, you know, stick the knife in Trump right after January 6th. He was very vulnerable. The American people were absolutely disgusted. Some of his media allies, some of his top allies. And they backed away from that. And you're never going to get that opportunity back ultimately. Also, in the wake of the midterm elections, that was when he was kind of at his weakest. It was really clear he was an electoral liability, especially his election conspiracies. In terms of the midterm results, DeSantis had a great night ultimately in Florida. And, you know, nobody really moved into action to try to take him out then either, because they're all dealing with this prisoner's dilemma of they know whoever goes after him is likely to get nuked. So they're just hoping that somebody else is going to do their dirty work for them. And ultimately, no one is. They're not going to come to your rescue. If you want to take out Trump, you have to be able to make a cogent case against him that is going to land with the Republican base. I have yet to see any evidence that any of these people are up to the task.
That I agree with.
All right, so this was another little nugget from CPAC. Steve Bannon was there, and he basically declared all-out war on Fox News. Take a listen.
Okay, Murdoch, here's the way it's going to be, brother. You've disrespected Donald J. Trump long enough. Okay? He goes to East Palestine and gets the Biden administration. It's a global news event, and you don't cover it live. Is there that much happening on Fox News at 2 in the afternoon that you can't cover him live? He hasn't been on Fox News since he announced for presidency. Let me ask you, any guy that brought peace to the world for 4 years until the Chinese let off a bioweapon, right? Wouldn't you think, to have respect for the audience, you would have him back up here to talk about the geopolitical? If you had respect for people, wouldn't you do that? They don't respect you. Read the depositions. The deposition, they have a fear, a loathing, and contempt for you.
He's actually right about that last part. That was one of my takeaways from the deposition. Now, he doesn't mean it the way I do. The way I mean it is like they're willing to lie to their audience for ratings and money. His view was like, oh, they weren't willing to go along with the Stop the Steal conspiracies, and you know that he takes sort of the opposite approach in terms of his conclusion that they have contempt for their own viewership. But I do think that that is a logical conclusion from the depositions and all of the text messages that came out during that time period.
I do agree that there's a lot of contempt. Yeah, you're right. And in a way, they almost realize their own power. They're like, wow, people really believe a lot of what we say, and they're not even... Look, I mean, they're like all these people, totally captured. But I do think that he isn't wrong, which is, look, you know, with Fox, they have had a yo-yo on Trump from the beginning. They were against him, then they were for him whenever he was good for ratings. And do any of us have any real, like, confidence that after he wins a nomination that they will be covering him and going to bat for him? And of course they will. So just stop the game. Stop pretending. That's actually what I find most disgusting. Like, in general, with all of these, just treat everybody fairly. You know, they shouldn't be blocking him off. Also, I guarantee you that's not what his audience wants either. So they're trying to have it both ways, where they're an active influence in the Republican Party, but then they also bow to their viewers whenever the time comes. So you really do need to pick one. Just give people what they want, and I think that's what those people want.
I think I'm gonna tell you a little bit more about, you know, what was revealed in the depositions and all of that going on behind the scenes, because I do think it is a fascinating look at the way these cable news outfits actually operate and what they actually care about. But a really clear takeaway here is that, you know, all of the idea of, okay, Fox News determines what the Republican base cares about, and Fox News tells the Republican base who they're going to vote for and who the right candidate is. That may have been the case at one point.
Maybe 2004.
Maybe that was the case at one point.
Right.
It is really not the case anymore, because they wanted to push back on the Stop the Steal conspiracies, and ultimately there was such a revolt from their own audience, and like instantaneous, especially over the Arizona call, that they changed the way they were operating, and they sort of gave some of their primetime hosts in particular free rein to indulge the most insane of the conspiracy theories with regard to Stop the Steal. So the idea that they are going to be able to have control over the Republican primary, and that since Ron DeSantis is their guy, they're going to be able to push Ron DeSantis on the Republican base. I mean, listen, maybe the Republican base chooses Ron DeSantis. That is certainly still a possibility. I don't want to rule it out. But it's not going to be because Fox News decided this is the candidate, because they have lost control of the Republican base to the extent that they ever had them. And I do think it is really obviously, like, blatantly biased that they've been having DeSantis on for all kinds of like puff pieces and softball interviews and going down to Florida and all of this. And we tracked this even before the midterms. They started in this direction. They would put together these pieces like cherry picking voters that would say, oh, I love Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis is great. And Trump reportedly is on a soft ban at the network. He has not been on since he announced his candidacy, and neither have any of his like family members and children, I think, are also on the same soft ban. So it's really clear what side they have come down on. They definitely prefer DeSantis to Trump. Is that ultimately going to matter? I kind of don't really think so.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I mean, why don't we go to the deposition?
Yeah, okay, so go ahead and put this. This is a deep dive from the New York Times about some parts of this deposition. This is all with regard to the Dominion lawsuit against Fox News. I have no insight into whether this lawsuit is ultimately going to succeed, but I can say that what has come out of it has been quite fascinating. So the headline here is Inside the Panic at Fox News after the 2020 election. If we hadn't called Arizona, said Suzanne Scott, who's the network's chief executive, according to a recording reviewed by the New York Times, our ratings would have been bigger. Yeah, and the whole article, I'll give you some of the specific details here, but that's basically the whole tenor of what was going on at Fox News behind the scenes. After they called Arizona, which, by the way, they were right about, they had developed their own proprietary system to predict and accurately call races across the country. That's why they were ahead of the game on Arizona, something that news networks would typically be very proud of.
Yes.
But there was such a massive backlash, they actually ended up firing the two key people who were involved in making that correct decision because there was such a viewer backlash. And then, and this is also, I mean, this is really astonishing, they debated internally how they should handle ultimately calling the race for now President Biden, because they knew they were likely to be first because their system was better than all of the other networks, but they did not want to be first. So they decided to actually sandbag it and wait for the other networks to call, even though they had gotten the official call from their own election desk like a day earlier. But they waited intentionally to try to take the heat off. And then, like I said, the two people who were involved in making those accurate, correct calls first of any of the networks get fired for it. So let me read you some of the details here. They say a little more than a week after television networks called the 2020 presidential election for Biden, top executives and anchors at Fox News held an after-action meeting to figure out how they had messed up, not because they'd gotten the call wrong, but because they'd gotten it right, and they'd gotten it right before anyone else. Typically, it's a point of pride for a news network to be the first to project election winners, but Fox is no typical network, and in the days following the 2020 vote, it was besieged with angry protests, not only from President Trump's camp, but from its own viewers, because it had called the battleground state of Arizona for Biden. Never mind the call was correct. Fox executives worried they would lose viewers to hard-right competitors like Newsmax. And so on Monday, November 16th, Suzanne Scott, who was the head of the network, and Jay Wallace, the network's president, convened a Zoom meeting for an extraordinary discussion with an unusual goal: how to keep from angering the network's conservative audience again by calling an election for a Democrat before the competition. They floated a bunch of different ideas. Maybe, Fox executives used, they should abandon this sophisticated new election projecting system, which Fox had invested millions of dollars, and go back to a worse, less accurate model they had been using before. Or maybe they should base calls not solely on numbers, but on how viewers might react. Or maybe they should delay calls, even if they were right, just to keep the audience in suspense and boost viewership. Here's a quote. Listen, it's one of the sad realities. If we hadn't called Arizona those 3 or 4 days following the election day, our ratings would have been bigger, Suzanne Scott said. The mystery would have still been hanging out there. And there's a lot more like that. And by the way, Brett Baer and Martha McCallum, who were held on as like, you know, the pinnacle of their news gathering, whatever, they were deeply involved in this, and they were on the same side of like, hey, let's wait, because they were the ones getting a lot of the pushback from viewers. They didn't like taking the heat. And so they were also in favor of, let's sandbag, let's let the other networks make the call, even though we are likely to know ahead of everybody else.
Yeah, look, I mean, I think one of the things we always try to emphasize here is how bad all 3 of these cable networks are. I mean, look at this. This is how much contempt that they have. They are willing to abandon their proprietary system just because they're afraid of what their core viewer base may think. That's outrageous. I mean, they are willing to abandon their actual factual calls on the state of Arizona and others based on the millions of dollars that they spent on the system and supposedly we're very proud of, all because it goes against the editorial direction of the network. It just shows you that, like, literally the feelings do trump facts over there. And all of these, I really do feel that way.
The money trumps facts overall.
Right. And our ratings would have been higher. I mean, and then going and firing some of the people that were involved. It's just totally ridiculous the way that they handle themselves. And that's why they need to pick. You can either go editorial, you can go facts. You can't do both.
Yeah,
you just can't.
I'm reminded of back in 2012 when it was becoming, they had really sold to their audience leading up to 2012 presidential election, that a toaster could beat Obama, anybody could beat Obama. He was completely hated. You know, Mitt Romney was a shoo-in. And so then when election night comes and the results are not turning out that way, you know, there was a lot of sort of panic and meltdown on the network. And in particular, Karl Rove they had called Ohio. And Karl Rove was like, no, this is too early. I'm talking to people. This county's out. That county's still out. And Megyn Kelly famously said to him, like, is this real math, or is this just math you do as a Republican to make yourself feel better? And it led to an extraordinary television moment where they took the camera, she walked down the hall to the decision desk, they live on air justified why they made that call, et cetera, and didn't back down. And that was in the pre-Trump era, when I think they still felt a lot more confident with their position vis-a-vis the Republican base. Now they don't have that same level of confidence that they can, stick to the facts when it comes to something as black and white as did the president win this state or not. They clearly don't feel that same level of confidence, and they are terrified that their viewer base is going to abandon them in droves. But I think it really is an extraordinary window into not just Fox News, but CNN and MSNBC. I mean, they have these same business incentives. Ultimately, it is not about facts. It's not about journalism. You could see this certainly in the Russiagate coverage, for example, over at MSNBC. It's about feeding an audience the things that they want to see and feeding them the things that they can tell are going to juice ratings, regardless of whether they are the most important stories or whether those stories are ultimately accurate. So I think that's why these texts and these internal meetings are so extraordinary, to actually watch it laid out in black and white, like on their own voices. These are all recordings from this Zoom meeting, explaining that the thing they care the most about is the ratings and that they're terrified of their own audience. There's one more piece of this that I think is worth getting into. Rupert Murdoch admitted as part of his deposition, go ahead and put this next piece up on the screen, guys, that some Fox News hosts had endorsed Trump's false election fraud claims. He acknowledged this in unveiled question and answers from his deposition. He was asked if he was, quote, now aware that Fox endorsed at times this false notion of a stolen election. Murdoch responded, quote, not Fox, meaning not the network, no, not Fox, but maybe Lou Dobbs, maybe Maria Bartiromo as commentators. He went on to say some of our commentators were endorsing it. They endorsed. So an acknowledgement there of, what was kind of plainly obvious to anyone who was watching this all unfold at the time.
All I would say is this is a sign of a dying organization. Whenever you're dying, one of the ways that you want to make sure that you're not in a precarious spot is to get to some tipping point where you may tip you over to the point where you're just ultimately going to fail. The 2012, that's when their ratings were much stronger. They had a much better hold on linear TV. They didn't feel as under threat by Newsmax, by OAN, and all these others.
There were no real competitors.
You know what the irony is to all of this? This whole thing, all this idiocy might cost them $1.6 billion in a settlement with Dominion.
Yeah.
That at the end of and not to mention the reputational damage of all of the depositions that now Steve Bannon, your enemies from the left and the right, are using against you. So not playing it straight may actually cost you even more in the long run. Just an idiot move from the very beginning.
The last thing I want to say about this, because we see this in independent media as well. In fact, you see it in some ways more often in independent media because cable news networks, I mean, a lot of their pay comes from advertisers, from other corporations, from the cable news carry rates. Ratings are actually kind of secondary in terms of their profit and business model, but audience capture is very real. And if you go down the path of consistently just leaning into feeding your audience whatever it is you think that they want to hear, this is the place you're going to end up in, and where you have backed yourself into a corner, where you increasingly compromise your own ethics, morals, and integrity to try to guess what the audience really wants to hear, versus cultivating an audience that expects to be challenged at times, that expects that sometimes they're going to disagree with you and is not going to have like a panic attack and freak out and melt down and run away the minute that happens. So listen, they've walked themselves up to this ledge over many, many years, and it's no surprise that at this point they feel like they can't possibly back away from it.
Sometimes you got to take the hit. Maybe one day we'll tell you about how much money we lost on Afghanistan and on Ukraine. Maybe one day we'll reopen the wounds of what it cost to actually just tell you what we really thought about Afghanistan. I have no regrets about that entire situation.
Absolutely not.
When winter comes to Boston, Seasons Heatings come right along with it. You can hear them sizzling in kitchens citywide, taste it in every kind of spice, and see it in the steam of our soups and sake. You'll find it tucked snugly under your high thread count covers, in the charm of our neighborhoods, and of course, crackling in the fireplaces of bars, taverns, and hotel lobbies alike. Yep, when winter comes to Boston, things heat up in a hurry. Book your trip at meetboston.com.
All right, guys, let's turn back to Ohio. This is a story we do not want to stop focusing on. And we've got some news this morning, which is there was another Norfolk Southern train derailment in the state of Ohio. Let's go ahead and take a look. This is some extraordinary video we're going to put up on the screen. You can see someone is recording this from their car. They're at a train crossing. The train starts to come off the tracks. It's hitting like the sign posts there that, that tells you need to stop for the train. Car starts backing up. He probably needs to turn around and get the hell out of there. Absolutely terrifying to watch this unfold. And ultimately, about 20 cars of this cargo train derailed. As they point out in this article, put this up on the screen, this is the second derailment, obviously, of the company's trains in Ohio in a month. Unlike the February 3rd derailment, now they did initially respond with hazmat, with first responders in hazmat suits, just to make sure there was nothing toxic aboard this train. Apparently, there were no hazardous materials aboard this train, according to the Columbus Dispatch. It had no passengers. It derailed about 5 p.m. on Saturday by State Route 41 near the Clark County Fairgrounds. And they asked residents initially within a small radius, about 1,000 feet of the derailment, to shelter in place, but they did not issue formal evacuation orders. Once again, Sagar, highlighting just how common derailments are in this country. And again, this is not something that is a global phenomenon, specifically a problem here because of industry capture and the fact that we have rolled back so many safety regulations that are designed to try to prevent terrifying incidents such as this one.
Well, yeah, and 5,000 residents had to evacuate. It's not a joke, right? I mean, people are terrified, obviously, especially
Shelter in place,
all
yeah.
the shelter in place, and they didn't know exactly what they were going to do. People are still afraid of what's happening with the toxic chemicals. They don't have any response. They don't have any confidence right now in the government over their handling of the crisis. And I mean, really, why should they? So, we're almost over a month now into this entire thing. It's beginning to move and slightly out of the headlines. And one of the things we're learning is that there's almost 1,000 train derailments a year in this country. And everyone's like, see, why are you focusing on? I'm like, wait, hold on a second. So how many are in the rest of the developed world? Oh, we're orders of magnitude higher than everybody else? Okay, America's a big country, certainly have more rail lines, mileage, etc. than many others, maybe China and a few others that might even come close. But why does this keep happening here? And look, in those countries, there's pluses and minuses to any system, but over there they have much more stringent regulation and bigger fines and bigger punishment for anybody who is caught breaking the rules like this.
Yes, exactly right.
Yeah.
At the same time, pretty extraordinary interview with our friend Pete Buttigieg, Secretary of Transportation. Let's go ahead and put this up on the screen. This was a CNN interview that he gave, I presume thinking that he was going to get a softball-friendly treatment here. The headline is just incredible. Pete Buttigieg starts to rethink how he does his job in wake of Ohio train disaster. Oh, really? Oh, really, Pete? It wasn't enough, the supply chain crisis, wasn't enough the airline crisis, the fact that we've had, multiple issues and catastrophes in terms of air travel as well. It took you till this moment to realize maybe that you weren't handling things in quite the right way by being completely absentee and seemingly only caring about ribbon cutting ceremonies. Something that he, by the way, admits to in this. This is what I find so extraordinary, because we've been saying this for a while. Obviously he wanted this job because he wanted to be transportation secretary so he could dole out checks, fly around the country, take pictures with mayors, take pictures with governors, do the ribbon cutting ceremonies. He actually acknowledges in this piece that that is precisely what he wants to do. It's astonishing. He says, Buttigieg says what he'd rather be doing is trips like what he did on Monday, opening the first new airport terminal in Kansas City since Vice President Spiro Agnew was there for a ribbon cutting. Buttigieg arrived late, courtesy of being stuck on his own delayed Southwest Airlines flight, LOL, celebrating the groundbreaking on a record-busting $4 billion electric vehicle battery plant in DeSoto, Kansas, and talking transportation programs with students at the University of Missouri. So, openly admits here that is the sort of thing that he would rather be doing, as opposed to holding corrupt industries like the airline industry and like the rail industry to account. He does acknowledge he should have gone to East Palestine, Ohio earlier. He said he failed to anticipate the political fallout from the toxic train derailment, despite months of transportation problems like mass flight cancellations and air traffic control system shutdown that left many Americans frustrated. But he also punched back at critics, arguing that many of the problems he's being blamed for are only partially connected to his portfolio and mostly out of his direct control. So once again, Sagar, it's not his fault. He's powerless. He can't really do anything. This isn't in his portfolio. And he only cares that he didn't go to East Palestine, Ohio earlier because it became a political problem for him. That's pretty obvious from his comments
We
as well.
just had another near miss on the tarmac. The FAA is in a complete disaster. You know, I think we'll probably cover it tomorrow.
Yeah.
There's a major conference being called about these terrible safety events. And with the shutdown, the FAA is in bigger shambles than it's been in decades, actually, according to the pilots and the regulators themselves. What are you doing? You know, you can claim all day that you didn't have responsibility, but you do now. You were the Secretary of Transportation. And really, when he says that, he's saying, I don't want to do my job. I don't want to get intimately involved. You know, people who are in positions of power like this, they wrangle the troops, they cut through the red tape, and they try and deliver. And I also found it was extraordinary, as you said, at the top of it, just knowing what he really admits is, yeah, I didn't expect that I would have to work this hard. That's real. I think he's absolutely fundamentally lazy, having come from the corporate world and being a small town mayor of where it's, you know, plot twist, actually didn't do that good of a job. We covered some of the transportation and infrastructure failings that he had while he was the mayor of South Bend. He was completely unqualified, and worse, now that he's in this position, he is using his allies in the media to do little puff pieces like this, where even this like moderately strong piece, he, you know, the other thing that drove me crazy is he tried to conflate criticism of him with people online who were criticizing the boots that he was wearing. Maybe there was, I didn't see it.
I didn't even
see much of that commentary. What I did see are people saying, hey, you know, it's BS that you didn't come here for days and that you're not taking responsibility. He says, quote, it's bullshit that it's the idea that he went there because Trump had already gone there. It was apparently already on the books. I don't know if I believe that. I'm not sure I believe that at all. I think Biden probably called him and said, you need to get your ass to East Palestine right now.
Listen, I don't know if it was specifically because of the Trump visit, but it was 100% because of the political pressure and the fact that this became very hot. And yes, the right picked up on this and, you know, wanted to use it as a cudgel. No doubt about it. Although I want to give a lot of credit to the Republican senators who have signed on to a bipartisan bill that would actually do something real about rail safety. We'll see if that goes anywhere in the Republican House.
President Biden just endorsed it, so that's a big deal.
President Biden endorsed it. That is all genuinely positive to see that kind of progress. But yeah, the right picked up on this, but it wasn't only the right. I can promise you it was not only the right. Plenty of people on the left and even a few members of his elected members of his own party were critical of this response as well. And his takeaway from this piece too, what he lays out is he doesn't feel that the actual actions that he took with regard to his job, he doesn't feel like that's where he messed up. He feels like he messed up on the optics. Why does he feel that way? Because optics are all this man really genuinely cares about.
That's a good point.
And it's not the optics. I mean, him going to East Palestine, it does matter when you have government officials show up and make it clear that we are focused on this. This is a priority. We care. We see you. We understand the pain. He even says himself, being there, seeing the twisted metal and smelling the chemicals in the air, it is much different than reading some report, some sort of like, you know, arm's length distance report, sanitized report about what's going on in the ground. So it matters being there. But what matters a hell of a lot more is what you did up to this point and what you're going to do moving forward from this point. And he continues in this piece to just pretend like, oh, this isn't really my fault. I really can't do anything about it.
Yeah,
it's disgraceful.
Congenitally is unable to take responsibility.
Correct. Yeah. 100% correct. At the same time, still a lot of questions about what is in the air, what is in the water, is it actually safe in this town, and are there going to be long-term health impacts from this quote-unquote controlled release of toxic cancerous chemicals? Let's put this up on the screen from the Washington Post. The EPA has now, a month later, ordered testing for highly toxic dioxins at the Ohio derailment site. The agency ordered rail company Norfolk Southern to test the Ohio derailment area for dioxins as a dangerous and persistent class of pollutants. I don't know why the hell they're asking Norfolk Southern to do it too. By the way, just go do it yourself. My God, like, why are we trusting the polluters to be the ones that are handling these critical tests? Do you really think that residents are going to feel confident in tests that were paid for and managed by Norfolk Southern, the very people that caused this catastrophe? Putting that aside, they say here, after weeks of questions about contamination associated with this train derailment, they ordered rail company Norfolk Southern to test the area for dioxins. That's a dangerous class of pollutants that is created when plastic is burned. The train, of course, that crashed was carrying chemicals that were used to make plastics. They go on to say a course of academics, environmentalists, and residents have been raising alarm about potential dioxin contamination because days after the derailment, Authorities who were seeking to avoid an explosion purposely released and burned chemical vinyl chloride. That is a key component of PVC plastics. EPA officials say it's a low probability of dioxin contamination, but they want to go ahead and test to make sure. Just so you guys know a little bit more about what dioxins are, because this wasn't something that I think was broadly known before this situation. They're produced when you burn anything from wood and fossil fuels to municipal waste and cigarettes. Combustion releases chlorine stored in those substances. It reacts with other compounds to form dioxins. The pollutants are of particular concern when plastic is burned because chlorine is a key element of plastics. They are linked to cancer, reproductive and developmental problems, and immune system damage. They're particularly troublesome because they are slow to break down in the environment. They build up in the food chain, and that the EPA said that most human exposure to dioxins in the U.S. is tied to releases that occurred decades ago. They didn't respond to questions about why it was Norfolk Southern who was tasked with conducting these tests.
Why are they the ones who are conducting the test? Why did the EPA wait so long to conduct this test? And at one point, and you got to wonder, are they waiting for stuff to dissipate? Like, how does that work? Why did they wait a month in order to order this? They should have ordered it within the first week. So still a lot of questions. And who knows, what if that test does pop positive, and if Norfolk Southern is even going to give you proper data? You can't. These are not a trustworthy custodian of data, and has a direct financial interest in terms of fines and in future regulatory authority to hold them accountable for making sure that they don't have to pay as much as possible. This is total craziness.
I don't understand why they waited so long. I don't understand why you would use Norfolk's. Well, I do understand. It's because they want this all to go away. That's the reason. Okay, let's not be clueless here. Yeah, they wanted to go away, so they put it off as long as they could. But there have been too many people, and not just like random people like us who don't know anything about chemicals on TV talking about it. Actual researchers who deal with this stuff are saying, hey, you got to check this out and make sure. Maybe you think there's a low probability, but you have to make sure, because we're talking about serious long-term issues for the residents of this town who need to know whether it is safe for them to continue to live there or not. And of course, if this is declared a public health emergency, if it's declared basically, this town is now toxic to live in, that's obviously going to have major implications for the government, for Norfolk Southern. And so that's why they have tried to tamp down on all of this. But we are certainly going to keep our eye on it.
Absolutely.
All right, guys, so we officially have one Democrat in the race. Remember, Joe Biden hasn't officially announced yet, although most people think that he's going to run. But best-selling author Marianne Williamson, who ran last time around as well, she announced she is officially running for president, seeking the Democratic nomination in a speech at Union Station over the weekend. Let's take a listen to a little bit of that.
This system is intrinsically corrupt. We can see it in the broken windows. We can see it in the shattered factories. We can see it in the addiction-addled brokenness of our fellow citizens. We can see it in the despair. We can see it in the addiction. We can see it in the anxiety. We can see it in the depression. And people in this town, if they will not care enough to solve the problems that produces all that despair, half the people in this city don't even notice it. They are so buffered from the ravages of human suffering, they don't even mention the word poor. They don't even mention the word poverty, much less address its deeper causes. So some people in this city just don't even seem to care. Some people in this city, with some very brave exceptions, apparently don't have the spine or the moral courage to fix it. Ladies and gentlemen, let me in there. I will.
So Democrats, fresh off the heels of lots of grandiose rhetoric about how much they care about democracy, how committed they are to the people having a voice.
How's that going?
How are they responding to this? Obviously with complete contempt and dismissal. Let's go ahead and put this up on the screen from the Hill. The headline here is Democrats brush off Marianne Williamson's 2024 primary challenge. And there are some incredibly smug and condescending quotes here. Matt Bennett, co-founder of the centrist think tank Third Way, he said, I hope and expect they will completely ignore it. She is not a credible candidate in any respect. She certainly isn't going to be challenging to win the nomination. If that's the only primary challenge he faces, Joe Biden can rest very easy until the general election. An aide to Congressman Don Beyer said on Twitter, hi, AP, in response to an AP article calling her a major Democrat. Marianne Williamson is not a major Democrat. Thank you for your attention in this matter. And listen, whatever you think of Marianne and her chances here, number one, again, she is actually unopposed at this moment. She is the only Democrat who is in the race. Number two, it's up to the voters to decide. Democrats have already effectively rigged the primary for Joe Biden by putting South Carolina first. They're saying they don't even want to do any debates. So all of their rhetoric about how much they care about democracy. I mean, they're obviously total hypocrites when it comes to them maintaining their own grip on power. And I would also say, your guy here is going to be closer to 90 than he is to 80 by the end of his term. You have a majority of Democrats and an overwhelming majority of the country who are like, please don't run. So save me your like smug commentary about how solid he is in terms of his standing vis-a-vis the American people.
Not just that. I mean, look, Marianne was able to get to the debate stage as a Democratic candidate at a time when senators like Cory Booker and many others were not able to. This is a person who was able to raise the requisite number of funds and to actually hit the requisite 2% in polling to get there. Trump, I mean, right now, Biden is actually acting weaker than Trump. Trump is actually willing to have these Republican candidate debates. We have GOP primary debates, which are already being negotiated with the major cable news networks, where we would anticipate a Nikki Haley, a Vivek Ramaswamy, or any of these people, if they do qualify, to head up against him. So why don't you put yourself up in the same way? Jimmy Carter actually famously won his challenge while he was president in the debate stage against Ted Kennedy. And, you know, the Carter campaign says that he was worse off for it. I'm not so sure, because it actually got him in some fighting spirit when he was able to go up against Reagan. Now, obviously, he lost.
Jimmy Carter didn't need any help losing.
No,
he lost all
right.
on
He lost
his
right
own,
on all
okay?
his own. It's a good point. And I'm just generally of the opinion, do you remember the first debate between Obama and Mitt Romney where Obama lost? I mean, it was terrible. And one of the reasons that came forward is Obama was in a bubble for 4 years. He had not debated anybody. Whereas when he was the actual candidate, he did like 17, 18 primary debates in 2008. That made him sharp and ready to take on McCain. So even a challenge where you presume that the candidate is going to win anyways, it's actually very good for them, by and large, to actually go through some competitive process.
This is what we were talking about earlier with Ron DeSantis and how he's doing himself a disservice by keeping himself away from any potentially adversarial media and being very careful and very cautious about the interviews that he takes on, because you need practice. Ultimately, you really need practice in order to be able to effectively compete in an election. I mean, and Biden didn't really get any last time around because of COVID. That essentially rescued him, and he could kind of hide in the basement for most of the general election. He does very limited and very, cautious media appearances as well. So yeah, he could use that blade sharpened, no doubt about it, if that's even possible at this point. And if they were not, if they really felt secure about their position vis-a-vis Joe Biden, then they wouldn't be worried about Marianne Williamson. She dropped out before the vote, after Iowa last time around. Yeah, she made it to the debate stage, but she wasn't a huge factor. Like, this is fine. We're not worried about it. The fact that you've had this incredibly fragile response to her, I think is really interesting. And they have a big problem on their hands in New Hampshire in particular. Those people are pissed about the rewriting of the primary calendar, because you have effectively stripped all of the sort of power and relevance of that entire state, and especially of the party faithful within the state of New Hampshire, who have openly come out, including a sitting member of Congress, Democratic member of Congress, and said, we want primary challengers to Biden. We welcome primary challengers to Biden. We think he's going to have a problem in this state. Wasn't just these quotes in the Hill, though. Of course, MSNBC handling Marianne in a very similar